Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse was a huge moment in recent pop culture history and served as a true accomplishment of animated filmmaking, and is perhaps the most beautiful animation I've ever seen on the big screen. So when we got to the third act and got hit with that "to be continued," I had an influx of emotions. I was simultaneously excited and frustrated. Excited to see what was going to happen next, and frustrated I wasn't going to get to see it then and there. But in the time following this film's release, I've done quite a lot of contemplation on what I watched, and all of this theorizing has led me to one conclusion, and that is that Miguel O'Hara, alternatively known as Spider-Man 2099, is most likely a villain. When we first meet Spider-Man 2099, he's quite visually imposing, as he's perhaps the bulkiest of all the Spider people, but it's clear from the start that Miguel isn't a typical Spider-Man, and certainly stands out. Just off of his initial interaction with Spider-Gwen, we can see that 2099 is rather no-nonsense when it comes to his work, and he isn't quippy. And being a jokester is one of the key traits of Spider-Man, so the fact that he's so matter-of-fact with Gwen, and even gets upset with her for joking around, is kind of weird. There's also a brief moment where Miguel and Vulture are fighting in the sky, out of sight from everyone else, and 2099 rears his fangs as if he wants to bite Vulture. And this shot is honestly borderline demonic or vampiric. I mean, Miguel straight up looked like he was planning to bite Vulture's head off. And this would have been far darker than anything we've seen a Spider-Man do on the big screen. So just off of our first few minutes with Spider-Man 2099, it's clear that something is up with the character. It's just a matter of us finding out what. And I think we get a potential hint towards what this something might be when we find out some of 2099's backstory. You see, Miguel is from a universe where he lost his family, and after living with this devastating loss, he opted to find a different universe where his family was still alive, but the alternate version of himself had died. So he decides to leave his universe and take the place of his dead counterpart so that he no longer has to live without his family, and his still alive family now has a father/husband back in their lives. But this ultimately causes the new universe that Miguel went to collapse and be destroyed. And this is a rather tragic backstory, but it feels eerily familiar. Almost as if we've heard this tale before. And this is because it is almost the exact same motivation that Kingpin had in the first Spider-Verse film. You see, Kingpin's wife and son were killed in a car crash, and he made it his life's purpose to find a version of his wife and son from another universe and bring them to his. He just couldn't live in a world without his family. So I ask you, is that so different from what 2099 did? In fact, we don't really know 100% of what Miguel did, because his backstory is glossed over and told in the span of just a few minutes. So who's to say Miguel isn't lying, and he didn't actually kill the alternate version of himself in order to take his place? We also don't exactly know how his daughter died, so it isn't out of the realm of possibility that Miguel could be indirectly at fault for the loss of his family, just like Kingpin was. In general, there's a lot of mystery and unknowns surrounding the backstory of 2099, so the fact that the little of it that we do know is similar to the main villain of the first film, and the fact that he just visually looks sinister, lends me to believe that he isn't as heroic as he presents himself. In fact, one of the first things that caught my eye about Spider-Man 2099 was a similarity to another Spider-Verse villain, as visually his claws look extremely similar to Prowler's. Because there's this kind of mystery surrounding Miguel, it really makes me question his spouting on canon events. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to me that every single Spider-Person absolutely has to suffer great loss in order to become a proper hero. Just because the few Spider-Men that we've been exposed to have experienced this, doesn't mean they all have, unless someone is forcing them to. Perhaps because Miguel himself had to go through such hardship, he now does his best to ensure that every other Spider-Man has to, partly out of spite and partly because he thinks of it as a weird initiation ritual of sorts. But Miguel himself is an atypical Spider-Man. In Marvel canon, he wasn't bit by a spider to gain his powers, which is probably why we see Miguel inject himself with a weird serum at one point. But the fact that Miguel is an atypical Spider-Man makes me think that he might actually be the anomaly that he's claiming Miles to be. Maybe he's using Miles as a scapegoat to get attention off of himself. Perhaps he views Miles as a threat because if he manages to stop his quote-unquote canon event, then the other Spider-Men will realize that Miguel is lying about the necessity of canon events. and it would expose 2099 for the villain he truly is. Now, I know I'm saying a lot of maybes, perhapses, and potentiallys, but A, this is a theory video, and B, what else can we do with Miguel? He's an intentionally vague character, so we kinda have to theorize what he's been up to, and from where I'm standing, I think him being a villain is the most likely outcome. Just narratively, I would find it weird for Spot to be the sole villain for Miles to overcome. The Spot is given very little screen time in Across the Spider-Verse, and his backstory of getting hit by a bagel is a laughably bad excuse to hate Miles. It just feels like the Spot might be getting set up to be a red herring, and that Miguel will end up being the true final obstacle for Miles. So all in all, I think Spider-Man 2099 will ultimately be revealed to be a bad guy, or at the very least an anti-hero in Beyond the Spider-Verse, as there's just too many similarities to past Spider-Verse villains. He's an atypical Spider-Man in both his personality and how he got his powers, and there's just something not right with the character. Now maybe he's just a good guy too set in his ways, and you'll see the error of his mindset, but I just have a gut feeling he's up to something a little villainous. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video on Spider-Man 2099, please consider dropping a like or subscribing. And if you agree or disagree with my theory, or just have strong theories of your own on Beyond the Spider-Verse, as always, I'd love to hear them in the comments.